At the Millhaven County tax lien auction in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a man named Walter Briggs raised his hand and bought a decommissioned railroad repair depot for $4,100. Nobody else had bid. The building was a condemned shell on 11 acres of gravel and scrub, 3 collapsed bays, a roof that had partially caved in on the north side, and a concrete floor cracked so badly that weeds had pushed through it in long diagonal lines. The county assessor's office had listed the parcel at auction twice before without a single offer. The laughter in the room was not loud. It was the quieter kind, the kind that passes between professionals who recognize a mistake being made by someone who does not know better. Bridget Holcomb, the Regional Acquisitions Director for Landcore Development Group, was standing near the registration table with her phone already in hand when she turned to the colleague beside her and said, without particularly lowering her voice, $4,000 for a teardown. That man just paid to have a problem delivered to his driveway. The colleague smiled. A few people nearby heard it and nodded. Walter signed the transfer documents at the county clerk's table, folded his copies into the inside pocket of his jacket, and walked to his truck without looking at anyone. His truck was a 2006 Dodge Ram with a sun-bleached hood and a dent in the rear quarter panel that had been there long enough he had stopped noticing it. He drove home at the speed limit, made dinner for his 15-year-old son Eli, and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours afterward with a topographical survey, a utility map, and a set of handwritten notes that had taken him 4 months to compile. He did not tell anyone what was in those notes, not yet. 90 days later, Bridget Holcomb would make the drive to find him herself. What Walter Briggs had seen in that building, nobody in that auction room had been looking for it. Stay with this story, because the ending is not what you expect. Walter had worked in commercial infrastructure assessment for 22 years before the company that employed him, a mid-sized logistics consulting firm based in Memphis, was absorbed in a merger and his position was eliminated along with 37 others. He was 51 years old. He had a son, no partner, a mortgage that was manageable, and a reputation in a field that had just restructured itself in a direction that left experienced independent contractors on the outside looking in. He did not panic. He had seen the industry contract before, and he understood one thing about contracting markets that younger people sometimes missed. The chaos always revealed undervalued assets that the fast-moving money overlooked because it was moving too fast to look carefully. He started attending county tax lien auctions not as a buyer but as a student. He watched what sold, what didn't, and who was bidding on what. He took notes in a spiral notebook he kept in the glove compartment of his truck. After 8 months, the notebook was full. He had identified a pattern that no one at those auctions seemed to be tracking, and it had to do with infrastructure that predated the county's current zoning maps. The Millhaven Depot was the clearest example he had found. The parcel sat at the intersection of 2 old rail spur lines that had been decommissioned in 1994. The lines themselves had been pulled up for scrap, but the right-of-way easements those lines had occupied, a combined corridor of nearly 40 feet running northeast to southwest across 6 miles of East Baton Rouge Parish, those easements had never been legally extinguished. They were still on the books. Dormant, overlooked, buried in county deed records under layers of subsequent transactions that nobody had bothered to trace backward. Walter had traced them backward, all the way back to the original 1947 Rail Corridor Agreement. What that corridor represented now in 2024 was not a train route. It was a ready-made right-of-way for fiber optic cable or utility conduit, a pre-cleared legal path through 6 miles of territory where new easement acquisition would otherwise require negotiating with 47 separate property owners. Any telecommunications company or utility planning to expand broadband infrastructure in the eastern parish would need to either acquire new easements parcel by parcel or find an existing corridor already in place. Walter had found one. It came with a condemned building on 11 acres that nobody wanted, and you could buy the whole thing for whatever the county would accept as a minimum opening bid. He had offered $4,100 because he wanted to be sure it cleared the county's recovery floor and he did not want to spend more than he had to before the work was done. His total savings at the time of the auction were $6,400. His friend Ray Odom had known Walter since their time working together on a port expansion project in Shreveport in 2009, and Ray was the only person Walter had told any of this to. Even Ray was not fully convinced. He had driven out to the depot the week before the auction and stood in the collapsed bays with his hands in his pockets looking at the broken ceiling and the cracked floor and the light coming through the roof in the wrong places. "I've watched you work a long time," Ray said, "and I've seen you be right more times than makes sense. But this one I don't see." Walter said he knew. "You're putting in almost everything." Walter said he knew that too. Ray was quiet for a moment and then said, "All right," and asked what he needed help with first. On the morning of the auction, Walter had left the house while Eli was still asleep and driven across town before the county office opened. He wanted to arrive before the room filled with the usual cluster of developers and real estate investors who attended these events in groups and treated the whole exercise as a social occasion. He had nothing against them personally, he simply found it easier to think in a quiet room. When the Millhaven parcel came up, the auctioneer described it in the flattest possible terms. 11 acres, decommissioned industrial structure, condemned status, sold as is, minimum opening bid $4,000. He looked around the room with the patience of someone who had sold unpopular things before. Walter raised his hand. The auctioneer confirmed the bid and waited. Nobody moved, going once. A couple of people turned to look at Walter the way people look at someone who has done something worth watching, going twice. Someone in the back of the room said something to the person next to them and both of them smiled. Sold. It was a short moment, the kind that looks like a conclusion from the outside and is actually a beginning from the inside. Bridget Holcomb's comment reached Walter on his way to the parking lot. She had not said it to him directly. It carried across the room at the particular volume of someone accustomed to having their observations treated as the correct ones. He heard every word. He stopped walking for a moment, not from hurt, just from the specific sensation of having your timing confirmed. He had expected something like that. The room had produced it on schedule. He got in his truck and drove home. The clip someone had taken on their phone ran 30 seconds. By the time Walter sat down to eat dinner with Eli that evening, it had been shared into several local real estate forums under the caption, "Guy pays $4,000 for a condemned building at tax auction, Land Corps exec has thoughts." The caption was technically accurate. Bridget saw it that night. Her communications manager sent her the link at 9:47 p.m. with a neutral message asking if she wanted to issue any clarification. She responded that she did not and put her phone down. She did not think about it further. It looked, from where she sat, like the end of the story. Walter spent the first week doing what he always did at the start of any project, a full inventory before any conclusions. He walked every inch of the 11 acres with a measuring tape, a soil probe, and the same topographical survey he had been working from for 4 months. He paced the collapsed bays, inspected the structural members that were still standing, cataloged the concrete floor conditions section by section, and measured the clearance under the intact portions of the roof. He was not assessing the building for demolition or renovation. He was documenting it as a legal asset with defined physical boundaries, because that was what it was. Ray came out on the third day and worked alongside him without asking too many questions. That was one of Ray's better qualities. He knew when information would come when it was ready, and when asking would just slow the process down. On the fourth day, Walter drove to the Baton Rouge office of the Louisiana Secretary of State and spent 3 hours with the recorded deed histories for the 6 parcels that abutted the old rail corridor on the northeast side. He made copies of 23 documents, some of them typed on paper that had yellowed to the color of old butter. He brought them home and added them to the binder on the kitchen table that already held the county easement records, the original rail corridor agreement from 1947, and the utility planning maps he had pulled from the East Baton Rouge Parish Infrastructure Database 3 months ago. He made coffee, organized the documents by date, and built a chain of title for the corridor that ran from 1947 to the present without a single gap. Then he called a utilities infrastructure attorney in New Orleans named Wallace Tran, a man he had worked with briefly on a pipeline routing dispute 8 years earlier. He gave Wallace a summary of what he had and asked for an opinion on the legal status of the dormant easements. Wallace called back the following morning. His voice had the carefully measured quality of an attorney who had something significant to say and was thinking about how to say it accurately. "The easements are intact," Wallace said. "Dormant doesn't mean extinguished. You need a court affirmation of continuity before you can convey them, but that's a standard filing. 4 to 6 weeks. Nothing contested about the underlying legal status." Walter thanked him, wrote down the timeline, and went back to work. What Walter did not know at the time, had no way of knowing, was that on the other side of Baton Rouge, inside the Gulf South offices of Meridian Broadband Solutions, a problem had been building for 11 months that had very specific dimensions. Meridian was a mid-tier telecommunications infrastructure company that had been awarded a federal broadband expansion contract covering rural and peri-urban parishes in the southeastern Louisiana corridor. The contract was worth $68 million in federal infrastructure funding, contingent on Meridian meeting a construction milestone requirement. Fiber laid and operational across a continuous 6-mile corridor in East Baton Rouge Parish by a statutory deadline that was now 14 months away. The problem was the corridor. Meridian's project director, a man named Stuart Fogel, had spent 11 months trying to negotiate right-of-way easements from the 47 property owners who sat between the company's existing network node on the western end and the substation connection point on the eastern end. 29 of those owners had signed, 18 had not, 3 had retained attorneys, 2 had filed preliminary injunctions against the survey access Meridian needed to proceed. The construction timeline required groundbreaking within 90 days. It was not going to happen on the current path. Stewart had a map on his office wall with the corridor drawn in red and the problem parcels flagged in yellow. He had been staring at it long enough that the yellow flags had become part of the wallpaper to him. He was staring at it on a Tuesday afternoon when his infrastructure legal coordinator, a young woman named Kim Tapper, knocked on the frame of his open door and held up a printed page. "I think you need to see this," she said. She had been doing a secondary title search on alternative corridor options, a task Stewart had assigned without much expectation when she had found the 1947 rail corridor agreement in the parish records. She had traced it forward and identified the legal owner of the anchor parcel at the southwest terminus, Walter Briggs. Purchased at tax lien auction, Millhaven County 31 days ago. Stewart looked at the page for a long time. Then he looked at the map, then he looked at the page again. "Get me everything on this parcel," he said. The first approach was indirect. The way first approaches usually are when the party making them does not want to reveal the full extent of their need. A man Walter did not recognize appeared at the depot on day 38 carrying a business card from an environmental assessment company and asking questions about soil contamination surveys. He was polite, thorough, and completely uninterested in the answers. His eyes kept moving to the corners of the property and then to the rear boundary line where the old rail bed had once run. Walter answered every question about soil contamination with the patience of someone discussing the weather. He confirmed that no surveys had been commissioned. He confirmed that the property was in early assessment phase. He thanked the man for stopping by and watched him drive away. He called Ray from the parking area of the depot. "Someone from Meridian," Walter said, "or someone working on their behalf. Give it a week and they'll send someone with an actual title." Ray said, "How long have you known about Meridian?" Walter said he had pulled their federal filing when he identified the corridor. It was public record. Ray was quiet for a moment and then said he was going to need Walter to explain this whole thing from the beginning sometime. Walter said he would, but first there was work to do. The secondary vehicles of the lot, so to speak, were the 11 acres in the building itself. Walter had no sentimental attachment to the structure. What he cared about was the parcel's legal configuration and the documentation of the corridor rights. But he was also a man who did not leave usable things unused, and so he had spent a portion of the first month clearing the collapsed bay at the north end of the building, shoring the structural members that could be shored, and making a section of the floor space weather-tight enough for use as covered storage. A local contractor who specialized in light industrial lease spaces had walked through with him in week 3. The man had made a verbal offer on a short-term lease of the usable square footage within 48 hours, a self-storage operator who needed overflow capacity while a permanent facility was under permitting. Walter had signed the lease. By day 40, the depot was generating rental income of $5,800 per month. He told Eli about the rental income over dinner one evening, not in a showy way, just as information that was true. Eli was 15 and had the specific quality of attention that teenagers have when they are trying to decide whether to be interested in what an adult is telling them. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "So you're making money on the building while you wait to make money on the land?" Walter said that was correct. Eli said, "That's like 2 plays at once." Walter said yes, that was one way to put it. Eli went back to his dinner but kept thinking about it, which Walter could tell from the way his fork moved. The formal approach from Meridian came on day 44. Stuart Fogel himself arriving in a company vehicle, presenting a card asking if Walter had a few minutes. He was direct in the way that people are direct when they have done the math and know they need something, and the most efficient path forward involves acknowledging that plainly. They stood in the cleared bay of the depot building, and Stewart laid it out without much preamble. Meridian needed the corridor. They had a federal contract and a construction deadline and a right-of-way problem that the old rail easements could solve entirely if the legal continuity could be confirmed and conveyed. He had seen Wallace Tran's preliminary opinion through the parish filing. He knew where Walter stood legally. He offered $85,000 for a right-of-way easement transfer and 6 months of access for groundwork. Walter looked at him for a moment. "No," he said. Stewart recalibrated. He had expected a counter. "What number are you working toward?" he said. Walter folded his arms and looked at the cracked floor where the weeds had pushed through and said, "That's the wrong question. The number isn't the part you need to understand yet." Stewart drove back to his office with less information than he had arrived with and more to think about. What Walter had not told him was that he had received a call 4 days earlier from a representative of a competing telecommunications company that had caught wind, through sources Walter did not inquire about, that the Millhaven parcel carried dormant corridor rights. They had offered $210,000 for an exclusive right-of-way conveyance. Walter had listened to the full pitch, asked 3 clarifying questions, thanked the representative, and said he would be in touch. He had not been in touch. He called Wallace Tran that same evening. He explained the situation. He asked whether accepting the competing offer would constitute any form of interference with the federal contract process. Wallace said no. Walter owned the asset. He could convey it to whoever he chose. There was no legal obligation to Meridian, no preferential right established, nothing that created a legal issue. As a practical matter, however, a conveyance to a competitor of the federal contractor could complicate the federal broadband timeline for the parish, delay infrastructure deployment, and result in litigation that would keep the corridor tied up for potentially years. Walter said he understood that. Wallace said, "What are you thinking about doing?" Walter said he wasn't sure yet. He said he'd call in a few days and ended the call. He sat at the kitchen table for a long while after that, not doing math, not reviewing documents, just sitting with the shape of the thing. The following morning he drove to the depot earlier than usual, before Ray arrived, and stood in the cleared bay by himself for a while. He was thinking about a conversation he'd had with his father 20 years ago, on the porch of the house where Walter had grown up in Natchitoches. His father had been a civil engineer for the state and had spent 30 years working on public infrastructure projects, roads and bridges and drainage systems. He had retired without much money and without much recognition and with an absolute absence of bitterness about either. He used to say that the work either added something to the place or it didn't, and if it did, you had done the right job regardless of who kept score. Walter's father had died in 2018. He had never seen the kind of work Walter did, the asset identification, the corridor research, the long patient process of seeing what a piece of land actually was before the market decided what it was. But Walter thought sometimes that the approach was not entirely unrelated to what his father had described. The work either adds something or it doesn't. He drove back home, made a second cup of coffee, and called Stuart Fogel. Stuart answered on the first ring. Walter said, "I want to tell you something before we talk further. A third party has approached me with an offer for an exclusive conveyance of the corridor rights. I'm not going to accept it. I'm telling you this so you understand the actual situation you're operating in. I'm not using it as leverage, I'm using it as information." There was a pause on Stuart's end that was longer than a normal conversational pause. "Why are you telling me this?" Stuart said. "Because the corridor should serve the parish," Walter said. "The federal contract is the path that does that. I have a condition that has nothing to do with the price." Stuart said, "What's the condition?" Walter said, "The broadband nodes that Meridian installs along the corridor. 4 of them need to include free public access terminals, outdoor weatherproof units, positioned at the closest accessible public point to each node, schools, community centers, bus shelters, whatever makes sense at each location. Meridian handles installation, maintenance, and connection for the duration of the federal contract term. No branding requirement, no press release required, just the terminals running." There was another pause. Stuart said, "That's a maintenance cost commitment over a multi-year term." Walter said, "Yes." "And in return?" "In return," Walter said, "I'll convey the easement for $420,000, and I'll do it in a timeline that keeps your construction schedule intact." The line was quiet long enough that Walter listened to the ambient sound of his kitchen for a moment, the refrigerator, a car passing outside. "I need to bring this to the board," Stuart said. Walter said he understood. He said he would need an answer within 10 days because the legal clock on the easement affirmation had its own timeline. Stuart said he would be in touch and ended the call. Ray arrived at the depot 40 minutes later and found Walter sorting through the utility map on the workbench with a coffee going cold beside him. "You called them," Ray said. "It wasn't a question." Walter confirmed it. Ray was quiet for a moment and then said, "The public terminal thing. Is that because of Eli?" Walter didn't answer right away. He looked at the map. Eli had mentioned once, in a casual way that teenagers used to signal things they consider too obvious to explain, that 3 kids from his school did their homework in fast food restaurants because they didn't have home internet access. He had said it in the context of complaining about group project logistics. He had not said it as a social argument or a policy position. He had just said it as a fact about the world he was living in, with the flat acceptance of someone who had grown up knowing that facts come in different weights. "Partly," Walter said. Ray nodded and picked up a utility map of his own, and they worked through the rest of the morning without discussing it further. The board meeting at Meridian took 3 days. Stewart called on the morning of the 4th day and said the board had approved the structure, with 2 modifications to the terminal placement specifications that Stewart read aloud and that Walter confirmed were acceptable. The legal team would need 5 business days to prepare the conveyance documents. Walter said that worked. He called Wallace Tran to notify him that the transaction was moving forward and to initiate the easement affirmation filing. He called the self-storage operator to extend the lease through the end of the quarter. He made a grocery list and drove to the store. That evening he told Eli the basic shape of what had happened. Not the full architecture of it, just the outcome. The depot had worked out, the numbers were what they were, there were going to be some public internet terminals installed in the parish as part of the deal. Eli processed this for a moment. Free access terminals, like for anyone? Walter said yes. Eli thought about it and then said, "Did you make them do that or did you ask?" Walter said he asked, as part of the price. Eli looked at his plate and then said without looking up, "That's good." They ate dinner. Eli went to do homework. Walter sat at the kitchen table with the binder open in front of him but not really reading it. The story of what had happened at the Millhaven auction circulated in a particular way over the following weeks. The real estate and infrastructure forums that had initially shared the clip of Bridget Holcomb's comment began circulating a different set of numbers: a tax lien acquisition at $4,100, a federal easement conveyance at $420,000, a 14-day turnaround on a 6-mile corridor problem that Meridian's legal team had been unable to solve in 11 months. The coverage in the professional circles was understated, the way coverage is when the people doing it actually understand what they are looking at. Nobody needed the numbers explained. The numbers explained themselves. Bridget Holcomb read the summary in her industry newsletter on a Thursday morning. She read it twice. Then she closed the newsletter and looked at her office wall for a while. She had made the comment at the auction without thinking very hard about it. It had been the easy response to an easy-seeming situation. She was experienced enough to know that the easy response was not always the accurate one. She was honest enough to acknowledge that she had not, in that moment, been operating at the level of accuracy she expected from herself. She did not issue a public statement. She did not reach out to Walter directly. She sat with the knowledge of what she had said and what the actual situation had been, and she did not try to make that knowledge comfortable. 3 weeks later, at a different county auction in the same room, she arrived early, found a seat, and spent the registration period looking more carefully at the parcels she had already dismissed as uninteresting. Walter was not at that auction. He had no reason to be. He had the garage and the binders and the long, patient work of the next thing which had already begun. There was a drainage easement corridor in St. Tammany Parish that had been dormant since 1982. He had been tracking it for 6 weeks. The easement affirmation for Millhaven closed on a Friday morning. Walter drove to the title office, signed the documents, shook hands with the Meridian legal representative who was professionally pleasant about the whole thing, and drove to Eli's school to have lunch with him in the cafeteria, which Eli found both embarrassing and clearly appreciated. In the way that 15-year-olds have of feeling both things at once without being able to say either directly, they ate the school's version of chicken and rice. Eli told him about a history project he had due the following week. Walter listened and asked one question about it that made Eli think for a moment before answering. On the way back to his truck, Walter passed the front entrance of the school where, according to the installation timeline he had reviewed, one of the 4 public access terminals would be positioned before the end of the following quarter. A weatherproof unit, accessible after school hours, available without a password or an account or a fee. He did not stop. He had a meeting with Ray in an hour and a survey map of St. Tammany Parish in the passenger seat and a second cup of coffee he had been meaning to finish since morning. The work either adds something to the place or it doesn't. His father had said that standing on a porch in Natchitoches 20 years ago, Walter had been 31 then, not yet sure what he was building, not yet sure the patience was going anywhere specific. He was 51 now, and the binders on the kitchen table held 34 years of documented corridors, dormant easements, overlooked right-of-ways, and the careful accumulated evidence that what looks like nothing is very often something, if you know what you're looking for and you're willing to do the work of looking. He drove toward the meeting with the window down. The October air had finally come in cool after a long summer, and it moved through the cab in a way that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. He reached over and turned the radio to a station playing something with a steady beat and drove the rest of the way without thinking about numbers or timelines or anything that required a notepad. Some things you keep not because they are finished, but because they are still going.